Good morning, everybody. Hope you all had a great weekend. Welcome to the stream. Thanks for the repost, Bill. Appreciate you. Don't forget, folks, check out the phoneboothpodcast.substack.com, obviously. But also follow Bill's example. like and share if you enjoy this. Okay, so just to kind of take a step back and recap. So we talked at first about whether God exists, and then we've been exploring how he exists and established certain things about the fact that he's an intellectual being of some kind, that he's the highest intellectual being, and that he's thinking of himself, and he understands all things through his essence, which is himself, is that thought that he's thinking. And now today we're looking at Friday we talked about how God's knowledge is not discursive like ours, and he understands all things simultaneously, but in an active way. So his attention is actually fully on all things at once, which is really humbling. But then now we're going to look at how, if you remember the second act of the intellect, the first one is to definition. The second one is combination and division, or the art of statement, where we say A is B, or we say A is not B. And reasoning, or the art of syllogism, is the perfection of the third act of the intellect, which is where this composition and division is not just of terms, but also of statements. So you string statements together to have, if done properly, you have certitude about the new statement that's formed, right? But that art of statement is called composing and dividing, right? So that's what the first chapter today, chapter 58, that God does not understand by composing and dividing. Through the same means, we can also show that the divine intellect does not understand in a matter of composing and dividing intellect. For the divine intellect knows all things by knowing its own essence. Now, it does not know its own essence by composing and dividing, since it knows itself as it is, and there is no composition in it. It does not therefore know in the manner of a composing and dividing intellect. Moreover, what is composed and divided by the intellect is of a nature to be considered separately by it. For there would be no need of composition and division if by apprehending the essence of a thing we grasped what belonged to it and what did not. If then God understood in a manner of a composing and dividing intellect, it would follow that he did not consider all things by one intuition, but each thing separately. We have shown the contrary of this above. Furthermore, there can be no before and after in God, but composition and division come after the consideration of essence, which is their principle. Hence, composition and division cannot be found in the operation of the divine intellect. Again, the proper object of the intellect is what a thing is. Hence, in relation to what a thing is, the intellect suffers no deception except by accident, whereas, as concerns composition and division, it is deceived. So to a sense, dealing with its proper sensibles is always true, but in other cases it is deceived. But in the divine intellect there is nothing accidental, but only that which is substantial. In the divine intellect, therefore, there is no composition and division, but only simple apprehension of a thing. Furthermore, in the case of a proposition formed by a composing and dividing intellect, the composition itself exists in the intellect, not in the thing that is outside the soul. If the divine intellect should judge of things in the manner of a composing and dividing intellect, the intellect itself would be composite. This is impossible, as is clear from what has been said. Again, the composing and dividing intellect judges diverse things by diverse compositions, for the composition of the intellect does not exceed the terms of the composition. Hence, the intellect does not judge the triangle to be a figure by the same composition by which it judges man to be an animal. Now, composition or division is a certain operation of the intellect. If then God considers things by means of composing and dividing, it will follow that his understanding is not solely one, but many, and thus his essence as well will not be solely one, since his intellectual operation is his essence, as was proved above. But it is not on this account necessary for us to say that God does not know enunciables. For his essence, being one and simple, is the exemplar of all manifold and composite things, and thus God knows through his essence all multitude and composition, both of nature and of reason. So in other words, it's saying he doesn't understand composition by means of composition, but he understands all the compositions by which we need to understand, and we formulate understanding. Understand? With these conclusions, the authority of sacred scripture is in harmony. For it is said in Isaiah, quote, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts," end quote. Yet it is said in a Psalm 93, quote, "The Lord knoweth the thoughts of men," which end quote, which thoughts evidently proceed from through composition and division in the intellect. Dionysius likewise says, quote, "Therefore, in knowing itself, the divine wisdom knows all things, the material immaterially, and the divisible indivisibly, and the many unitedly." So Dionysius, he's one of the early Christian writers. He was from Areopagus, so they call him Dionysius the Areopagite. One of the many things, in the modern age, everything was called into question. Everything became subjective. They started questioning all history as well. And so they started calling Dionysius the Areopagite. They started calling him Pseudo Dionysius because they thought the writings were just attributed to him, but not actually written by him. Well, I like to think that our understanding that we've had of things for 1,500 years is usually correct. If people are questioning, if a school of thought is questioning what the meaning of is, so to speak, or questioning whether or not some first principles, like we talked about before, whether or not something can be and not be at the same time in the same respect, then they have no business speaking on anything because they clearly don't have any actual. They don't believe anything actually truly exists. I was talking to somebody when I was studying in Rome. There was this unbalanced gentleman who would always creep out the ladies in the class because he was just one of those guys. He was creepy. He didn't understand personal space. He was eccentric. His eyes were all like... Anyways, I made the mistake once of trying to engage in trying to have a rational conversation with him because he was asking me a question about something that had just been covered in class, and he wanted to... So I was like, gave him the benefit of the doubt. We were talking, and he was arguing with like first principles, like really basic things that we know just on its face, like we were talking about, right? Like this, like the principle of non-contradiction that I just mentioned. And I actually said I was trying to get him to acknowledge this first principle, just so we could establish some common ground, and then move forward from there for the topic we were discussing, which I don't remember the particulars of the topic we were discussing. But I said to him, well, because he was like, my truth is different than your truth or something like that. And I was like, well, okay, yeah, you can say that from like a perception standpoint. But like, I exist. I'm standing in front of you. That's true. Even if 6 months ago, before we had a class together, you didn't know I existed, that doesn't mean I didn't exist. He's like, oh, no, for me, you didn't. And I'm like, well, someone on the other side of the school, the university, that hasn't met me yet, I still exist. I'm still here with you right now talking to you. And he's like, not to them. I'm like, okay, so not in their understanding and their perception, but that doesn't change the reality of the fact that I exist and am here talking to you. And he's like, no, in their universe, you don't exist. Okay. So I just kind of politely wound down the conversation and left, because you can't have a rational conversation. And that's the thing that this school of thought called modernism is so toxic, because it's like it's the kind of thought process, it's the kind of worldview that leads to ridiculous quotes like the Supreme Court Justice Kanjani saying she doesn't know what a woman is. She's not authorized. She's not qualified to give a definition of what a woman is. It's preposterous. Okay, let's read another chapter. This one is he was just talking about the enunciables, which is how we communicate ideas. And he's asking you whether that the truth of enunciables is not excluded from God. So, in other words, just because he understands things simply without the need for composition or division in his mind, in his intellect, doesn't mean that he doesn't understand composition and division, and that he doesn't understand all the different enunciables, the ways that we communicate and describe this composition and division. From this, it may be seen that although the knowledge of the divine intellect is not the sort of belonging to an intellect that composes and divides, truth, which according to the philosopher is found only in the composition and division of the intellect, is yet not excluded from it. For since the truth of the intellect is, quote, the adequation of intellect and thing, end quote, inasmuch as the intellect says that what it is and what it is not, inasmuch as the intellect says that what is and what is not, truth belongs to that in the intellect which the intellect says, not to the operation by which it says it. For the intellect to be true, it is not required that its act of understanding be adequated to the thing known, since the thing is sometimes material, whereas the act of understanding is immaterial. Rather, what the intellect is understanding, says and knows, must be adequated to a thing, so that, namely, the thing be such as the intellect says it to be. Now, by his simple understanding, in which there is no composition and division, God knows not only the quiddities of things, that's the definitions of things, right? But also enunciations, as has been shown. Hence, that which the divine intellect says in understanding is composition and division. Therefore, truth is not excluded from the divine intellect by reason of its simplicity. When the incomplex is said or understood, the incomplex of itself is neither equated to a thing, nor unequal to it. For equality and inequality are by relation, whereas the incomplex of itself does not imply any relation or application to a thing. Hence, of itself, it can be said to be neither true nor false. But the complex can, in which the relation of the incomplex to a thing is designed by a sign of composition or division. Nevertheless, the incomplex intellect, in understanding what a thing is, apprehends the quiddity of a thing in a certain relation to the thing, because it apprehends it as the quiddity of that thing. Hence, although the incomplex itself, or even a definition, is not in itself true or false, nevertheless, the intellect that apprehends that a thing is is always said to be through itself true, as appears in De Anima. That's Aristotle's treatise on the soul. Although it can be by accident false, insofar as a definition includes some composition either of the parts of a definition with one another, or of the whole definition of the thing defined. Hence, according as the definition is understood to be the definition of this or that thing, as it is received by the intellect, it will be called absolutely false if the parts of the definition do not belong together, as if we should say insensible animal. Or it will be called false with reference to a given thing, as when the definition of a circle is taken as that of a triangle. Given therefore by the impossible supposition that the divine intellect knew only in complexes, it would still be true in knowing its own quiddity as its own. Again, the divine simplicity does not exclude perfection because it possesses in its simple being whatever of perfection is found in other things through a certain aggregation of perfections or forms, as was shown above. But in apprehending incomplexes, our intellect does not yet reach its ultimate perfection because it is still in potency to composition or division. So too among natural things, the simple are in potency with reference to the mixed, and the parts with reference to the whole. According to his simple understanding, therefore, God has that perfection of knowledge that our intellect has through both knowledges, that of complexes and that of incomplexes. But our intellect reaches truth in its perfect knowledge. That is to say, when it already has arrived at composition. Therefore, in the simple understanding of God, as well, there is truth. Again, since God is the good of every good, as having every goodness in himself, as has been shown above, the goodness of the intellect cannot be lacking to him. But the true is the good of the intellect, as appears from the philosopher Aristotle. Therefore, truth is in God. And this is what is said in a psalm, but God is true. So, tomorrow we'll go into that God. We'll start to ask the question, establish and reflect on that God is truth, and then how is he truth, and in what ways can we say he's truth? So it's interesting. What he was saying is he was drawing it, and he was underlining that our mode of understanding, because of our imperfect understanding, is to combine and divide different concepts together, and by that we get to a deeper understanding of things. But God, with his simple act of understanding, he understands all things in their perfection profoundly, perfectly, simply, right? So, and he also kind of said at the end there that we come to truth through composition and division, but then that's a simple understanding of the truth once the truth is established. One of my favorite analogies, which we've discussed which I've mentioned in the past, is that motion is to rest as argument is to conclusion, or as reasoning is to conclusion, right? And this is an important concept because our mind rests when it comes to certain knowledge about things. There's a epistemological tradition, if you will, a philosophical tradition of thought called phenomenology, that is much more recent, I would say, in the last century or so, where they just, if any of you've ever read any of John Paul II or any of his writings, he was a phenomenologist. It's the most pointless school of thought because they never come to conclusions about anything. So it's literally the philosophical model of thought is like beating around a bush. They literally will just look at the bush from every angle without ever concluding anything about the bush with certainty. So it's just, from this angle, we can observe this phenomena. From that angle, we can observe this. And sure, there's some merit and value. I mean, you could even argue that Aristotle and Thomas have something of that in the way that they'll examine something from every angle. Like we've looked at how God thinks. Is it this way? Is it that way? And so you can see that we're examining all the different nuances of the things that we're considering, but with the aim towards coming to some conclusion and establishing some increase in knowledge and understanding in ourselves. So we're actually coming to conclusions and resting in those and then moving on to other considerations. If we were to just spend the whole book asking whether or not God existed, but never actually come to a certain opinion about it, or certain knowledge about whether or not there's a God or whether or not he exists, then we would be doing phenomenology. There's no claims ever. There's no growth of the mind or understanding ever. It's literally just a futile exercise. If motion is to rest, like reasoning is to conclusion, it's like driving around the block forever, never actually having a destination. So perhaps it has the framework of a good beginning of a conversation and a intellectual exercise and a pursuit of knowledge and truth, but it's completely devoid of any fruit or intelligible result or positive outcome, because you're literally driving around the block using up gas without any destination. So we're at about, let's see. Yeah, so we're making really good progress here, guys. We're at essentially now, tomorrow we will read chapter 60. And there's only 92 chapters, I think. 95. Let's see. Nope, there's a bunch of real short ones toward the end here, and so we're looking at 102 chapters total. So we're almost 2/3 of the way there to the end. And then at that point, as mentioned before, we're going to take a break from the very precise and rigorous intellectual ponderings of the Summa Contra Gentiles of Thomas, and we're going to read something a bit more inspirational or whatnot. So I think what might be good is there's a book, there's a series of on history called Warren Carroll. It's by Warren Carroll. It's called The History of Christendom, and it's incredibly well written, 5-volume set on the history of the world from a Christian perspective. And it makes sense if it's true. So even if you don't believe that God became incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ, even if you don't believe that, it would make sense, if that's true, that all of history would be most accurately seen through the lens of building up to that incarnation and then the consequences that flowed from that incarnation. That would make sense. So from that position, it's actually really neat. One of the some of the his observations, especially of like ancient history, are really beautiful. So it's definitely worth a read. It's very, very well written, and he is very well sourced. He sources all of his perception and claims of the different events in history very accurately and thoroughly. So but it's also masterfully written, and you can feel the flow. And his philosophy on history is, oftentimes we'll study in school. We study political movements or things like that guided the course of history. And his thesis is that it's individuals and their lives and their subjective experience of the world around them and the events around them that caused them to do this or that thing that had sometimes catastrophic, sometimes wonderful results in history, depending on the situation we're talking about, obviously. So it's really cool. It's great. It would be a great change of pace from what we're doing, but still give us and there'll be more to talk. There'll be more to talk about as well. I know that in the comments it's tough to kind of chime in with stuff that's so technical sometimes. It's just food for thought, and it's hard to really engage from your guys' perspective because, what do you say? It's a lot of the stuff that we read is good for reflecting on throughout the day after we read it together, and maybe there's a kernel or so that can be taken away. But I think it'll be interesting to dig in and look that over together and go through some of those stories, some of which are quite incredible of the how historical events played out. So, well, that's all for today. Cheers. Enjoy the rest of your day and the rest of your cup of joe. Don't forget, of course, to check out phoneboothpodcast.substack.com. And until tomorrow, have a great day.